Gothic novels always seem to be anchored by a mysterious mansion. And they are usually somewhere in England or Europe, in in the mountains, in the moors, preferably someplace with really bad weather, you know. And I love Gothic fiction, and for the longest time I was thinking, is there a way that I could take Gothic tropes, elements of the Gothic, and transplant it to a different place and time, like Shanghai? And sort of this thought had been going round in my head, and one day I came across an old photograph of a mansion called Denart, which was built in on the outskirts of Shanghai in 1898 by a very wealthy British barrister named Vern Drummond. And he was one of those who became what they call a Shanghai lander. Shanghai became his home, even though he called England home. Shanghai was actually where he became successful. And in those days, just before the Second World War, Shanghai was starting to develop further out west of the city, and people were building enormous houses, like up to 10 acres of property with a huge mansion. Denart itself had stables for Drummond's polo ponies and housing for his servants, tennis courts, rose garden, an artificial lake, just like in the story. And it was huge. But this was actually apparently not uncommon. And by the way, Denart still stands. I mean, the land around it has been filled in with housing, but that particular building still stands, and it's now a museum or a cultural center or something. So it was, but when I saw that photo, I thought, I think I have the mansion, because for me, I need to be able to see where my characters are and how they're moving around. So I have a huge detailed map of Shanghai from 1935, made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, by the way. And and I also have like floor plans of old mansions, because in your head, you're thinking, okay, now my heroine is going up the spiral staircase and she has to move off into one of the corridors. Yeah, yeah. And I was able to find pictures of Denart, the lake, the interiors of the house, plus a news clipping for when the house was sold off after Vern Drummond died and his widow sold it off. So, like, with a listing of all of what the house was like, the interiors, the furniture, and so on. That was kind of thrilling. So, and it was a very crazy time in Chinese history, because Shanghai was made up of foreign concessions, territories that were conceded to foreign nations by the Chinese government. Back then, it was the Qing dynasty. It was the time of the last emperor. So within those concessions, they followed British law or French law. There was and so if you were being tried for a crime that you committed within the concession, you would be tried either under British law or French law, not Chinese law. Okay. You could literally run from, if you were a burglar, you could literally run from the Chinese part of Shanghai into the international settlement, and the Chinese police could not follow you in there. Yeah. So that was the mansion. But also there was this crazy mix of East-West. So I knew that my characters had to be a Chinese woman and an American woman. My first heroine her name is Li San Liu, and Li San is an orphan, but she was picked up off the streets of Shanghai by her guardian, Master Liu, who belongs to a very, very wealthy clan, and he's been sort of really kind to her in an absent-minded way. And sent her off to a really, really good school. So she's literate in Chinese and in English. But the thing about Lisan is she has no memory of what her life was like before being brought into Master Liu's household. And she also knows that she can't count on this free ride much longer. I mean, she's graduated from high school. She needs to find a job. And this is something that's actually very unusual for a woman at that time. So she's got a little bit of feistiness to her, as well as a strong instinct for survival. On the other hand, we have Caroline Stanton, who is the polar opposite. She is American. She is newly married. She is, in her own right, extremely wealthy. Her parents died and her aunt and uncle died, so she's an heiress twice over. Not only that, but she's married to a millionaire, a guy who Thomas Stanton, who owns silver mines in California. But they've come to Shanghai because Thomas's uncle, Mason, has said, let me bring you into the railroad business, and there's fortunes being made all throughout Shanghai. And Caroline is actually really anxious to get away from her past because she was one of the near victims. She was a survivor of a terrible avalanche known as the Wellington Avalanche in Washington State in 1910. It was the worst railway disaster in the US, probably in all of US history. 98 people died when an avalanche came and slammed trains off their track and into the ravine. And she survived. Her aunt and uncle died. Her parents had died way before then. So she's, people would understand that she would want to leave this behind. And to her, Shanghai is a fresh start. And rather than hire a social secretary, because she's going to need a social secretary, she is now just by virtue of her wealth, her and Thomas's wealth, they are already the cream of Shanghai society or white Shanghai society. So, but she decides she wants to hire a Chinese social secretary because then a social secretary who's American or who speaks English might be able to give away her secrets. And she likes her privacy. She doesn't want her friends quizzing her secretary, and they would never stoop to speak to a Chinese secretary. So that's fine. Plus, she has a household to run, and not all the servants speak English. So she figures she can get things up to speed by having someone who is bilingual. So that's the background. And Lisan gets the job. She moves into Lenox Manor, which is based on Denard, but I made it like spookier, uglier, in worse shape. And almost from the moment that Lisan arrives, she sees the figure of a woman in red. And her childhood nightmares start happening again, something that has not happened in years and years. And she starts wondering if she's going crazy. And at the same time, not at the same time, but during a party that Caroline throws, a very unwelcome guest approaches Caroline and says, I know your past and I can expose you. Andrew Gray. Yeah. And he is definitely from her past and is a past she does not want brought to light. And then at the same party, where Lisan is sort of working the coat check kind of thing, another guest comes with Andrew Gray, the notorious scandalous Manchu princess Masako Kyo, who has been raised in Japan, has come back to China. She has a terrible reputation. She's known to have had many, many lovers, and she'll dress up in men's clothing sometimes. And she approaches Lisan and said, I know who your family is. And Lisa is completely flabbergasted because she has no clue who her family is. She thinks she's an orphan picked up off the streets. So these two women have issues of identity now. And there's this veiled menace for Caroline, not so veiled, for Lisa, kind of veiled menace of what would happen if the truth comes out. I find dialogue a very useful way to convey history and background and facts. Definitely there's the voices and the way that each of them speak. When there's the point of view from Lisan, she, I think you'll notice that Lisan refers to the Americans as foreigners. And then when Caroline is talking from her point of view, she's regarding the Chinese as foreigners because that's both their different points of view. But it's a really great question about dialogue because it's a very useful way to convey what's going on, like background knowledge. So, for example, the ghost of a suicide in Chinese folklore is considered the most dangerous ghost of all because the only way they can move on in the afterlife is to have someone else commit suicide or driving them crazy or something. And this is quite the superstition. But, as an author, if you write the most feared ghost, in Chinese mythology is the ghost of a suicide block, it starts sounding like a history lesson. But if you put that in the mouths of, say, the servants downstairs, and they're talking about it, then you are conveying a bit of knowledge, a bit of background, and it doesn't sound like a history lesson. So I like to use dialogue that way. Not the terrible, but did you know, Henry, that such and such and such that, but to work it into a natural conversation.